Welcome to this compilation of 4 sci-fi short stories about monsters and mayhem. I'll be narrating The Flying Tuskers of Knick by Jack Sharkey, In the Avu Observatory by H.G. Wells, Infiltration by Algis Budrys, and No Strings Attached by Lester Del Rey. If you find yourself enjoying the stories, make sure to hit the like button. That's the best way to help the channel continue to grow, along with checking out all the other stories here on the channel and Substack. More on that later, but for now let's get stuck in. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Flying Tuskers of Knick by Jack Sharkey. Narrated by William Skye. Handsome, athletic, debonair, a man of powerful charm as well as solid worth, I'd give anything to conquer my one real fault, my darned modesty. I have trod many tangled jungles, explored the floors of innumerable oceans, and braved death in so many forms that a man less magnificent than myself would have died of fright. But if there is one event that stands out in my perfect memory, that can still raise a goosebump or two on my broad tanned shoulders, the event is when I went hunting for the Flying Tuskers of Knick. There we were, myself and my faithful old purple Andromedan guide Mimp, out in the vast blue-white desert of Polaris III, looking for the Flying Tuskers. Knick, the region we trod, was much feared by the Polaris III natives. They were a superstitious bunch anyway, who panicked at the very thought of being trampled or gored, and never ventured into the region of the Tuskers. I, a man of clear head and no nonsense, laughed at their primitive fancies. I set out nonetheless into the desert, with only the barest rudiments necessary for survival. We could get none of the local boys for bearers, so Mimp had to carry everything. Naturally, I had to have both hands free to use my Moxley 55, the best ray rifle you can buy anywhere in the colonized universe. Aside from the ray rifle, I carried nothing save a 14-inch carbon steel bolo knife slung to my belt, my ever-present calabash pipe crammed full of steaming yakweed, expensive to have imported from the Martian canals, but I buy it by the carton, and my trusty F9 Ultiflex binoculars on a short platinum chain. Mimp struggled along behind me as we set off into the desert. Even his mighty plum-hued muscles quivered under the load of our gear, which included an inflatable pseudo-log hut with fireplace, an optional extra, a double-oven radium-powered cookout stove, and a 7-pound crate of signal flares, just in case we got lost. 3 days we ranged the shifting blue-white sands of Knick, watching everywhere for signs of the herd we'd heard occurred in that region. Nothing. "Keep sharp lookout," I snapped at Mimp over my shoulder. Mimp was like a brother, but you have to keep these aliens in their place. "Yes, Bwana," said Mimp. He called me Bwana always. "Soon we come to Waterhole." I didn't ask him how he knew. Andromedans have a knack for geography. In many ways, they're almost as good as an Earthman. "Good," was all I answered. It was short, to the point, and showed who was boss. Onward we trekked, a sunburnt duo casting long bronze shadows across the burning sands of Knick. A thin plume of yakweed fumes marked our passage. It was nearly sunset when we spotted the pink glitter of that sickening slop that is the Polaris III excuse for water. I stood watching the sunset while Mimp unloaded all the gear and began to set up camp. As the last rays faded in the sky, I turned and entered the pseudo-log hut Mimp had inflated. Hard on his lungs, of course, but I hadn't wanted to burden him with the extra weight of a hand pump. I'm a stern man, but I'm fair. He had my slippers laid out beside the armchair by the fire, and a cool mint julep awaiting me on the small teakwood tabaret. He was busying himself in the kitchenette, whipping up a quick soufflé with one hand and tossing a small salad with the other. "Hurry it up there," I growled jovially. "Time is money, time is money." A bit of friendly joshing is good for the relationship, Shows Mimp I'm tolerant of him sharing the same quarters, without actually making me act like an equal, if you know what I mean. "I hurry, Sahib," said Mimp. "Coming up." He always called me Sahib. He rushed across the room and began setting the table with my pearl-handled silverware. "No, not there," I yawned, picking up my julep and settling back into the armchair. "I think I'd like the table nearer the piano so you can play Chopin nocturnes while I dine." I added as a kindly afterthought, "You can reheat your share of the soufflé later, after I've gone to bed." Personally, I hate cold soufflé. "Yes, Effendi," said Mimp. He always called me Effendi. Rapidly, he moved the table over to the Steinway, set out the finished soufflé and salad, and then hurried to the piano and began laboriously plunking out glorious melody. I took a sip of my julep, then spat it out on the carpet. "Mimp!" I roared, incensed. "Did you make this drink with Polaris 3 water?" Craven and cowering, he fell at my feet, whining for mercy. But I was adamant. You let an alien take an inch, and the next thing he swiped a parsec. "The knout," I said, keeping my voice emotionless and holding out my hand. "Please, Kimasabe," whimpered Mimp. "I dared not use the water in the canteens. You know that Polaris 3 water is poisonous to us Andromedans, while you Earthmen can tolerate it." "I cannot!" I raged. "I was speaking medically," he mewed piteously. "And I aesthetically," I snarled. "The knout, now, and be quick about it." He scurried on all fours to the bureau where I kept my odds and ends, and came crawling back with the brutal leather whip. I weighed the infraction, decided that 3 stripes should be lesson enough, and I laid them onto his bare back with a steady hand. "Now," I said, wearied by the effort, "play something gay and lilting." Hastily he dragged himself to the Steinway and complied. Dinner was really delicious. Next morning, before sunup, we lay in wait for the herd behind a rock beside the waterhole. The sky was growing pale saffron near the horizon, then light yellow, and finally glaring brass as the sun arose. By sun, I mean the star Polaris, of course. Our sun is a star, you know. Or did you? I knew, naturally. Then, afar off, I espied the bulky blobs in the sky that were the flying tuskers of Kanik Knark. No man had ever hunted one before. I felt pretty proud, let me tell you. Onward they came through the air, their large skin-type grey wings flapping stolidly up and down, about 3 strokes to the mile. Enormous creatures they were, with fiery little eyes and long trailing trunks that had a wicked little hook at the tip. But the thing that really caught one's eye was their tusks. 10 of them, 8 originating in the mouth, and 1 in either foreknee. Each tusk was 7 feet in length, long, white, straight-tapered, and flawless. But not ivory, not on these babies. Pure pearl, that lovely lustrous calcareous concretion. Each tusk would bring 50,000 interplanetary credits on the open market. And there were 10 per elephantine beast, and at least 60 of them in the herd. "Look at that, will you?" I cried to Mimp. "Look, feast your ugly eyes on that gleaming fortune swooping down upon us, Mimp." "I look, I feast," he murmured servilely, huddled behind me behind the rock behind the tree. Aliens tend to be cowardly when their lives are in danger. Carefully, I raised the rifle and took a bead on the youngest beast in that descending herd. It's slightly illegal to shoot the fledglings, but after all, I wasn't going to bring him back with me, so no one would know. It's just that I find that when I shoot the eldest in a herd of wildlife, the others miss their protector and flee. But if I shoot one of the babies, the elder ones stay around to protect it, and I get to kill lots more. Nasty, perhaps, but that's the hunting game for you. Anyhow, I took this bead on the beast. I was just in the act of depressing the firing stud when an unwanted lightness in the weapon caught my attention. Irritated, I cracked open the firing chamber. "Mimp!" I growled in one of my rare real wraths. You didn't load the ray rifle. Even a Moxley 55 is no damned good without cartridges. 1,000 pardons, boss, muttered Mimp, inclining his loathsome lavender face in a subservient bow. I go get. He wriggled away across the sand and into the hut, fortunately not disturbing the herd, which was now kneeling on the slope above the waterhole and inhaling that putrid pink liquid through their trunks. I drooled a bit, seeing the rainbow glint of sunlight on those magnificent tusks. Seconds passed, then minutes. The herd was practically slaked, and still no crawling Mimp reappeared from the hut. Soon they'd fly off and cost me a fortune. I was already pretty much in hock after paying the fare to Polaris 3 from Earth. I'd been able to save a little by listing Mimp as baggage and storing him in the hold for the flight. Angry, irked, and pretty well enraged, I moved swiftly toward the hut on hands and knees, scuttling in the doorway as fast as I could, lest the herd see me and flee or attack. In the parlour, I stood erect and glanced about. There was no one in sight, but the back door was open. "Mimp!" I bellowed, stamping across the carpet. "Where are you, you off-colour blemish?" No reply. "This means 6 stripes with the knout," I warned him. Then I heard a faint sound, not unlike that of a 14-inch bolo knife being brought down hard upon the inflating valve of a pseudo-log hut. I felt at my belt. My bolo was missing. "Mimp!" I hollered, much too late. Then the whole damned room, piano, fireplace, carpet, armchair and all, snapped in upon me, and I was wound up with those rubberized walls tighter than the centre of a golf ball. I think I must have swooned then. Much, much later, by dint of tooth, fingernail and sheer grit, I had gnawed, clawed and wrenched my way free of the collapsed hut. A stunning sight met my eyes. All about the waterhole, the flying Tuskers were still kneeling. Every one of them was dead and already beginning to rot. But the infuriating thing was that not one of them had so much as an inch of tusk anymore. Every beast had been detusked, the priceless pearl shafts lopped off flush with the thick grey hides. Mimp! And with my bolo knife already! At least he'd left me a canteen. I tasted it. Pwah! Pink Polaris 3 slop! The dirty little... But I saved it anyhow. I had a long, lonely walk back to town ahead of me. And there it was that I learned even worse news. Mimp had already sold the tusks and was on his way back to Andromeda with a fortune in his breech clout. I swore revenge then and there, but was unable to carry it out since I was short the rocket fare back to Earth and the authorities. It seemed that Polaris 3 is a neutral planet. Even the mighty word Earthman carries no weight there. So I had to hock the piano, my precious Moxley 55, and what could be salvaged of the soufflé, and even then I was only able to book passage as near Earth as Sirius 2. Luckily they had a consulate there. I was able to secure a ride home after some weeks' wait. By then, however, it was too late to avenge myself. Mimp, with his stolen fortune, had paid off his planet's debt to Earth. Andromeda 4, his home planet, declared its independence, and the Earth authorities throw up their hands and shrug whenever I hint at extraditing him. Seems he's the new emperor there or something. They can't afford to antagonize him. Damn. However, I suppose you're wondering just why I get goosebumps when I recall the flying Tuskers of Knik-Knak. Well, it wasn't so much the danger from the beasts, nor the hideous heat of that desert, nor my long, painful sojourn beneath the Steinway and the shrunken hut that was so bad. It was those Tuskers. Know how they died? Mimp had poisoned the waterhole. Unsporting and all that, but the thing that nags my brain is, why didn't I think of that? Me, bested by a lousy purple alien. What's the universe coming to? In the Avu Observatory by H. G. Wells. Narrated by William Skye. The observatory at Avu in Borneo stands on the spur of the mountain. To the north rises the old crater, black at night against the unfathomable blue of the sky. From the little circular building with its mushroom dome, the slopes plunge steeply downward into the black mysteries of the tropical forest beneath. The little house in which the observer and his assistant live is about 50 yards from the observatory, and beyond this are the huts of their native attendants. Thaddy, the chief observer, was down with a slight fever. His assistant, Woodhouse, paused for a moment in silent contemplation of the tropical night before commencing his solitary vigil. The night was very still. Now and then voices and laughter came from the native huts, or the cry of some strange animal was heard from the midst of the mystery of the forest. Nocturnal insects appeared in ghostly fashion out of the darkness and fluttered round his light. He thought, perhaps, of all the possibilities of discovery that still lay in the black tangle beneath him, for to the naturalist the virgin forests of Borneo are still a wonderland full of strange questions and half-suspected discoveries. Woodhouse carried a small lantern in his hand, and its yellow glow contrasted vividly with the infinite series of tints between lavender blue and black in which the landscape was painted. His hands and face were smeared with ointment against the attack of the mosquitoes. Even in these days of celestial photography, work done in a purely temporary erection and with only the most primitive appliances in addition to the telescope, still involves a very large amount of cramped and motionless watching. He sighed as he thought of the physical fatigues before him, stretched himself, and entered the observatory. The reader is probably familiar with the structure of an ordinary astronomical observatory. The building is usually cylindrical in shape, with a very light hemispherical roof capable of being turned round from the interior. The telescope is supported upon a stone pillar in the centre, and a clockwork arrangement compensates for the Earth's rotation and allows a star, once found, to be continuously observed. Besides this, there is a compact tracery of wheels and screws about its point of support, by which the astronomer adjusts it. There is, of course, a slit in the movable roof which follows the eye of the telescope in its survey of the heavens. The observer sits or lies on a sloping wooden arrangement, which he can wheel to any part of the observatory as the position of the telescope may require. Within, it is advisable to have things as dark as possible in order to enhance the brilliance of the stars observed. The lantern flared as Woodhouse entered his circular den, and the general darkness fled into black shadows behind the big machine, from which it presently seemed to creep back over the whole place again as the light waned. The slit was a profound transparent blue, in which 6 stars shone with tropical brilliance, and their light lay, a pallid gleam, among the black tube of the instrument. Woodhouse shifted the roof, and then proceeding to the telescope, turned first one wheel and then another, the great cylinder slowly swinging into a new position. Then he glanced through the finder, the little companion telescope, moved the roof a little more, made some further adjustments, and set the clockwork in motion. He took off his jacket, for the night was very hot, and pushed into position the uncomfortable seat to which he was condemned for the next 4 hours. Then, with a sigh, he resigned himself to his watch upon the mysteries of space. There was no sound now in the observatory, and the lantern waned steadily. Outside there was the occasional cry of some animal in alarm or pain, or calling to its mate, and the intermittent sounds of the Malay and Dayak servants. Presently, one of the men began a queer chanting song, in which the others joined at intervals. After this it would seem that they turned in for the night, for no further sound came from their direction, and the whispering stillness became more and more profound. The clockwork ticked steadily. The shrill hum of a mosquito explored the place and grew shriller in indignation at Woodhouse's ointment. Then the lantern went out, and all the observatory was black. Woodhouse shifted his position presently, when the slow movement of the telescope had carried it beyond the limits of his comfort. He was watching a little group of stars in the Milky Way, in one of which his chief had seen, or fancied, a remarkable colour variability. It was not a part of the regular work for which the establishment existed, and for that reason perhaps Woodhouse was deeply interested. He must have forgotten things terrestrial. All his attention was concentrated upon the great blue circle of the telescope field, a circle powdered, so it seemed, with an innumerable multitude of stars, and all luminous against the blackness of its setting. As he watched, he seemed to himself to become incorporeal, as if he too were floating in the ether of space. Infinitely remote was the faint red spot he was observing. Suddenly the stars were blotted out. A flash of blackness passed, and they were visible again. "Queer," said Woodhouse. "Must have been a bird." The thing happened again, and immediately after the great tube shivered as though it had been struck. Then the dome of the observatory resounded with a series of thundering blows. The stars seemed to sweep aside as the telescope, which had been unclamped, swung round and away from the slit in the roof. "Great Scott!" cried Woodhouse. "What's this?" Some huge, vague black shape with a flapping something like a wing seemed to be struggling in the aperture of the roof. In another moment the slit was clear again, and the luminous haze of the Milky Way shone warm and bright. The interior of the roof was perfectly black, and only a scraping sound marked the whereabouts of the unknown creature. Woodhouse had scrambled from the seat to his feet. He was trembling violently and in a perspiration with the suddenness of the occurrence. Was the thing, whatever it was, inside or out? It was big, whatever else it might be. Something shot across the skylight and the telescope swayed. He started violently and put his arm up. It was in the observatory then, with him. It was clinging to the roof, apparently. What the devil was it? Could it see him? He stood for perhaps a minute in a state of stupefaction. The beast, whatever it was, clawed at the interior of the dome, and then something flapped almost into his face, and he saw the momentary gleam of starlight on a skin like oiled leather. His water bottle was knocked off his little table with a smash. The sense of some strange bird creature hovering a few yards from his face in the darkness was indescribably unpleasant to Woodhouse. As his thought returned, he concluded that it must be some night bird or large bat. At any risk he would see what it was, and pulling a match from his pocket, he tried to strike it on the telescope seat. There was a smoking streak of phosphorescent light, the match flared for a moment, and he saw a vast wing sweeping towards him, a gleam of grey-brown fur, and then he was struck in the face and the match knocked out of his hand. The blow was aimed at his temple, and a claw tore sideways down to his cheek. He reeled and fell, and he heard the extinguished lantern smash. Another blow followed as he fell. He was partly stunned. He felt his own warm blood stream out upon his face. Instinctively, he felt his eyes had been struck at, and turning over on his face to save them, tried to crawl under the protection of the telescope. He was struck again upon the back, and he heard his jacket rip, and then the thing hit the roof of the observatory. He edged as far as he could between the wooden seat and the eyepiece of the instrument, and turned his body round so that it was chiefly his feet that were exposed. With these he could at least kick. He was still in a mystified state. The strange beast banged about in the darkness, and presently clung to the telescope, making it sway and the gear rattle. Once it flapped near him, and he kicked out madly, and felt a soft body with his feet. He was horribly scared now. It must be a big thing to swing the telescope like that. He saw for a moment the outline of a head black against the starlight, with the sharply pointed upstanding ears and a crest between them. It seemed to him to be as big as a mastiff's. Then he began to bawl out as loudly as he could for help. At that, the thing came down upon him again. As it did so, his hand touched something beside him on the floor. He kicked out, and the next moment his ankle was gripped and held by a row of keen teeth. He yelled again, and tried to free his leg by kicking with the other. Then he realized he had the broken water bottle at his hand, and snatching it, he struggled into a sitting posture, and feeling in the darkness towards his foot, gripped a velvety ear like the ear of a big cat. He had seized the water bottle by its neck and brought it down with a shivering crash upon the head of the strange beast. He repeated the blow, and then stabbed and jabbed with the jagged end of it in the darkness where he judged the face might be. The small teeth relaxed their hold, and at once Woodhouse pulled his leg free and kicked hard. He felt the sickening feel of fur and bone giving under his boot. There was a tearing bite at his arm, and he struck over it at the face as he judged, and hit damp fur. There was a pause. Then he heard the sound of claws, and the dragging of a heavy body away from him over the observatory floor. Then there was silence, broken only by his own sobbing breathing, and a sound like licking. Everything was black except the parallelogram of the blue skylight with the luminous dust of stars, against which the end of the telescope now appeared in silhouette. He waited, as it seemed, an interminable time. Was the thing coming on again? He felt in his trouser pocket for some matches and found one remaining. He tried to strike this, but the floor was wet and it spat and went out. He cursed. He could not see where the door was situated. In his struggle he had quite lost his bearings. The strange beast, disturbed by the splutter of the match, began to move again. "Time!" called Woodhouse with a sudden gleam of mirth, but the thing was not coming at him again. He must have hurt it, he thought, with the broken bottle. He felt a dull pain in his ankle. Probably he was bleeding there. He wondered if it would support him if he tried to stand up. The night outside was very still. There was no sound of anyone moving. The sleepy fools had not heard those wings battering upon the dome, nor his shouts. It was no good wasting strength in shouting. The monster flapped its wings and startled him into a defensive attitude. He hit his elbow against the seat, and it fell over with a crash. He cursed this, and then he cursed the darkness. Suddenly the oblong patch of starlight seemed to sway to and fro. Was he going to faint? It would never do to faint. He clenched his fists and set his teeth to hold himself together. Where had the door got to? It occurred to him he could get his bearings by the stars visible through the skylight. The patch of stars he saw was in Sagittarius and southeastward. The door was north, or was it north by west? He tried to think. If he could get the door open, he might retreat. It might be the thing was wounded. The suspense was beastly. "Look here," he said. "If you don't come on, I shall come at you." Then the thing began clambering up the side of the observatory, and he saw its black outline gradually blot out the skylight. Was it in retreat? He forgot about the door and watched as the dome shifted and creaked. Somehow he did not feel very frightened or excited now. He felt a curious sinking sensation inside him. The sharply defined patch of light, with the black form moving across it, seemed to be growing smaller and smaller. That was curious. He began to feel very thirsty, and yet he did not feel inclined to get anything to drink. He seemed to be sliding down a long funnel. He felt a burning sensation in his throat, and then he perceived it was broad daylight, and that one of the Dyak servants was looking at him with a curious expression. Then there was the top of Thaddeus' face, upside down. Funny fellow, Thaddy, to go about like that. Then he grasped the situation better and perceived that his head was on Thaddeus' knee, and Thaddy was giving him brandy. And then he saw the eyepiece of the telescope with a lot of red smears on it. He began to remember. "You've made this observatory in a pretty mess," said Thaddy. The Dyak boy was beating up an egg in brandy. Woodhouse took this and sat up. He felt a sharp twinge of pain. His ankle was tied up, so were his arm and the side of his face. The smashed glass, red-stained, lay about the floor, the telescope seat was overturned, and by the opposite wall was a dark pool. The door was open, and he saw the grey summit of the mountain against a brilliant background of blue sky. "Pah," said Woodhouse. "Who's been killing calves here? Take me out of it." Then he remembered the thing and the fight he had had with it. "What was it?" he said to Thaddy. "The thing I fought with." "You know that best," said Thaddy. "But anyhow, don't worry yourself now about it. Have some more to drink." Thaddy, however, was curious enough, and it was a hard struggle between duty and inclination to keep Woodhouse quiet until he was decently put away in bed and had slept upon the copious dose of meat extract Thaddy considered advisable. They then talked it over together. "It was," said Woodhouse, "more like a big bat than anything else in the world. It had sharp, short ears and soft fur, and its wings were leathery. Its teeth were little, but devilish sharp, and its jaw could not have been very strong, or else it would have bitten through my ankle." "It has pretty nearly," said Thaddy. "It seemed to me to hit out with its claws pretty freely. That is about as much as I know about the beast. Our conversation was intimate, so to speak, and yet not confidential." "The Dyak chaps talk about a big colugo, a clangutang, whatever that may be. It does not often attack man, but I suppose you made it nervous. They say there is a big colugo and a little colugo, and a something else that sounds like gobble. They all fly about at night. For my own part, I know there are flying foxes and flying lemurs about here, but they are none of them very big beasts." "There are more things in heaven and earth," said Woodhouse, and Thaddy groaned at the quotation, "and more particularly in the forests of Borneo than are dreamt of in our philosophies. On the whole, if the Borneo fauna is going to disgorge any more of its novelties upon me, I should prefer that it did so when I was not occupied in the observatory at night and alone." If you're enjoying the stories, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button. Thanks. Infiltration by Algis Budrys. Narrated by William Skye. If werewolves exist, they don't necessarily conform to all the superstitions people have. They may even know fear. Part 1. Sunset. "They're coming for me tonight," he knew as he woke. Sunset. Not really. If he were to get dressed now and go out on the street, the red globe would still be hanging over the cliffs of New Jersey. But the shadow of the building next door had fallen over his apartment windows, and he sleepily pushed a cigarette between his numb lips and swung his feet over the side of the bed, fumbling with a match as he walked over to the small radio on the windowsill and turned it on. There was a double-header between the Giants and Cincinnati. The first game was probably in its last inning. Sunset. Odd how the conditioning worked. Was it conditioning? Or were the old wives' tales not so absurd after all? But he could go out in the sunlight, had done it many times. His tan proved it. He touched silver and cold iron countless times each day, crossed running water, and he'd gone to church every Sunday until he was 12. No, there was a core of truth under the fantastically complex shell of nonsense, but the old limitations were not part of it. He shrugged. Neither were most of the powers. Still, he liked to sleep in the daytime. His schedule seemed to gain an hour at night, lose one in the morning, until almost unnoticeably it had slipped around the clock. He went into the bathroom while the worn tubes in the radio warmed up slowly, and washed his face, brushed his teeth, shaved. He combed his hair, then paused thoughtfully. Wouldn't do any harm. No full moon in here either, he thought, looking up at the circular fluorescent tube in the ceiling, but he noticed no impediment as he coalesced, dropped to all fours, and ran his pelt against the curry cones he had screwed to the bathroom door. He did a thorough job, enjoying it, and after he had realigned, walked out of the bathroom in time to hear the Giants making their final, fruitless out of the first game. 5-0 Cincinnati, and he grimaced in disgust. 4 shutouts in the last 5 games. He laughed at himself then for actually being annoyed. Still and all, it wasn't the first time a man became emotionally involved in a mirage. Was it a mirage? True, there weren't really any such things as the San Francisco Giants, but a man could certainly be expected to forget that occasionally if he were part of the same illusion at least half the time. And certainly such stuff as dreams are made of is solid enough when you are yourself a dream. He went out in the kitchen and started coffee, then came back and sat down next to the radio, hardly listening to the recap of the game. Odd how it had all started. Being suddenly marooned on this planet, forced to survive somehow through the long years while waiting for rescue. How many years had it been now? Some 500,000 in the subjective reference for this particular universe. He knew the formula for conversion into objective time. It all worked out to the equivalent of about 6 months, but that wasn't what mattered as long as they'd all had to survive in this universe. Sleep, suspended animation, if you want to call it that, had been the only answer, and they couldn't do that directly. They'd had to resort to chrysalids. He smiled to himself, got up and turned down the fire under the pot until the coffee was percolating softly. The original plan had snowballed somewhat. Resolving chrysalids was one thing, making them eternal was another, and unnecessary. It was far simpler to arrange the chrysalids so they'd be able to reproduce themselves, and of course in order to survive and take care of itself, a chrysalis had to have some independent intelligence. And so it worked. The chrysalis housed a sleeper, operating unawares and completely independent of him or her until the chrysalis wore out. Then the sleeper was passed on to a new chrysalis with neither of the chrysalids involved, nor for that matter the sleeper, conscious of the transfer. So it would continue through the weary subjective years, generation upon generation of chrysalids, until finally the paramathematical path drifted back to touch this universe, and the sleepers could wake and continue their journey. And if the human race chose to speculate on its origins in the meantime, well, that was part of the snowball. He got up again and turned off the flame under the coffee pot. Now, if I were a sorcerer, as defined by Cotton Mather's ilk, of course, he thought, I should be able to A. turn the fire off without getting up, or B. generate the flame without the use of Con Edison's gas, or C. if I had any self-respect at all, conjure hot coffee out of thin air. His lips twisted with nausea as he thought that 9 out of 10 people would expect him to be drinking blood as a matter of course. He sighed with some bitterness, but more of resignation. Well, that was just another part of the snowball. Because the chrysalids had done a magnificent job in all 3 of its subdivisions. They had kept the sleepers safe, and reproduced, and used their intelligence to survive. They had survived in spite of pestilence, famine, and flood, by learning enough to wipe out the first 2 and control the third. It would seem that progress was not a special quality to be specially desired. Most of the chrysalids were consumed by a fierce longing for the good old days, as a matter of fact. It was merely the inescapable accretion to sheer survival. And so came civilization. With civilization, recreation. In short, the San Francisco Giants and... He reached over, suddenly irritated at the raspy-voiced and slightly frantic recapitulation of the lost ball game, and changed the station. And Beethoven. He relaxed, smiling slightly at himself once again, and let the music sing to him. Chrysalids, eh? Well, they certainly weren't his kind of life, free to swing from star to star, riding the great flux of creation from universe to universe. But whence Beethoven? Whence Rembrandt, Da Vinci, and Will Shakespeare, hunched over a mug of ale and dashing off genius on demand with half an eye on the serving wench? He shook his head. What would happen to this people when the sleepers woke? The snowball. Ah, yes, the snowball. That was a good part of it, and he and his kind were another. If we had known, he thought, if we had known how it would be. But they hadn't known. It had been just a petty argument at first. Nobody knew now who had started it. But there were 2 well-defined sides now, and he was an insurgent for some reason. The winning side gives the names that stick. They were the Watchers, an honourable name, a name to conjure up trust and duty and loyalty. And he was an insurgent. Well, let it stand. Accept the heritage of dishonour and hatred. Somewhere, sometime, a gauge was flung and he was heir to the challenge. The chrysalids solved the problem of survival, of course, but the problem of rescue had remained. For rescue, in the sense of help from an outside agency, would be disastrous. When the path shifted back, they had to learn of it themselves and go on of their own accord, or go into slavery. For there is one currency that outlives document and token: personal obligation. And if they were so unlucky as to have an actual rescuer, the obligation would be high, prohibitively so. The solution had seemed simple at first. In each generation of chrysalids there would be one aware individual, one watcher to keep guard and to waken the rest should the path drift back in the lifetime of his chrysalis. Then, when that particular chrysalis wore out, the watcher would be free to return to sleep while another took his place. His mouth twisted to one side as he took a sip of coffee. A simple, workable plan until someone had asked, "Well and good. Excellent. And what if this high-minded watcher realizes that we, asleep, are all in his power? What if he makes some agreement with a rescuer, or worse still, decides to become our rescuer when the path drifts back? What's to prevent him, eh? No," that long-forgotten wary individual had said. "I think we'd best set some watchers to watch the watcher." Quis custodiet? What had it been like? He had no way of knowing, for he had no memory of his exact identity. That would come only with awakening. He had only a knowledge of his heritage. For all he knew, it had been he who raised the fatal doubt, or had been the first delegated watcher. He shrugged. It made no difference. He was an insurgent now. But he could imagine the voiceless babble among their millions, the argument, the cold suspicion, the pettiness. Perhaps he was passing scornful judgment on himself, he realized. What of it? He'd earned it. So finally, two groups, one content to be trustful, and the other a fitful, restless clan awakening sporadically, trusting to chance alone, which by its laws would ensure that many of them were awake when the path drifted back. The insurgents. So, as well, two basic kinds of chrysalids, the human kind and the others. Wolves, bears, tigers, bats, seals, every kind of living thing except the human, the insurgent kind. And so the struggle began. It was a natural outgrowth of the fundamental conflict. Which side had tried to overpower the first chrysalis? Who first enslaved another man? He thought, and half snarled. That too was unimportant now, for the seed had been planted. The thought was there. Those who are awake can place those who sleep under obligation. Control the chrysalids and you control the sleepers within. But chrysalids endure for one generation, and then the sleepers pass on. What then? Simplicity. Group your chrysalids, segregate them, set up pens for them, mark them off and do it so the walls and fences endure through long years. This is my country. All men are brothers, but stay on your side of the line, brother. Sorry, brother, you've got a funny shape to your nose. You just go live in that nice walled-off part of my city, brother? Be a good fellow, brother. Just move to the back of the bus, or I'll lynch you, brother. And the chrysalis die, the sleepers transfer into another chrysalis in the same pen. SPQR. Vive Napoleon. Sieg Heil. Some of the time it was the watchers. Some of the time it was the insurgents. And some of the time, of course, the chrysalids evolved their own leaders and imitated. For once the thing had begun, it could not be stopped. The organization was always more powerful than the scattered handsful. So the only protection against organization was organization. But it was not organization in itself that was the worst of it. It was the fact that the only way to control the other side's penned chrysalids was to break down a wall in the pen or to build a larger pen including many of the smaller ones. And again, it was too late now to decide who had been at fault. Who first invented war? The way to survive war is to wage more decisive war. The chrysalids had to survive. They learned. They progressed by so doing. They progressed from bows to ballistas to bombs, from arbalests to aircraft to A-bombs, phosphorus, chlorine, HE, fragmentation, napalm, dust and bacteriological warfare, Thermopylae, Cressy, the Battle of Britain, Korea, Indochina, Indonesia. And try to believe as you sit here, insurgent, that none of this is real, that it is all a phase acted out by dolls of your own creation in a sham battle that is really only a bad dream in the unfamiliar bed of a lodging for the night. Chrysalids they might be, insurgent, he lashed himself, but it was the greed and suspicion of all your kind, insurgent and watcher alike, that set this juggernaut to rolling. He took another sip of coffee and almost gagged as he realized it had grown cold. He got up and walked into the kitchen with the cup in his hand. He threw the rest of the coffee in the sink, washed out the cup, and turned on the burner under the coffee pot. One more thing. One more development born of suspicion. For the original one-watcher plan had been abandoned, of course, and here again there was no telling whose blame it was. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will watch the watchers? There had been many watchers to a generation, how many no one knew. They balanced each other off and they checked the random number of insurgents who awoke in each generation. So more insurgents awoke to check the watchers, and more. In spite of what the Transylvanians believed, a wolf is no match for a man except under special conditions. A tiger can pull a man down but cannot fire back at the hunters. A seal is prey to the Eskimo. So werewolves, child of fear, of watcher propaganda, and of 1/10 fact. The animals were insurgent chrysalids right enough, but for an awake insurgent to compete with a watcher, the insurgent too had to be a man or something like it. The coffee had warmed up. He poured himself a fresh cup and added cream and sugar absently. The refrigerator was empty. He reached in and turned it off. No more need for that after tonight. So that was the power the insurgents had, the only power, and the watchers had it as well. They could resolve their chrysalids into any form they chose, realign. A wolf could become a man without hair on his palm and with garlic on his breath if he so choose. A man, a watcher of course, could become a wolf. Thus the final development. Espionage and counter-espionage. Infiltration. Spying, if you chose. The insurgent smiled bitterly and drained the cup. And propaganda, of course. Subtle, most of it indirect, a good deal of it developed by the chrysalids themselves, but propaganda nevertheless. Kill the evil ones, kill the eaters of dead flesh, the drinkers of blood. They are the servants of the evil one. He almost retched. But you could hardly blame them. It was a war, and in a war you play all your cards, even if some of them were forced into your hand. Yes, and I've played genuine werewolf on occasion when I had to. He started to wash the coffee pot and the cup, then threw both into the garbage can. He walked back to the radio and dialed it away from Eroica and back to baseball. The Giants were losing 3-0 in the third inning. The house phone buzzed. He went to it slowly, picked it calmly off the hook. Yes, Artie? Mr. Disborough, there's a couple of guys coming up to see you. I'm not supposed to tell you about it, but, well, I figured, the doorman said. All right, thanks, Artie, he answered quietly. He almost hung up, then thought of something. Artie? Yes, Mr. Disborough. There'll be a couple of fifths of Jewers in my cupboard. I won't be back for a while. You and Pete are welcome to them. And thanks again. He hung up and began to dress, realigning his chrysalis to give him the appearance of clothing. The doorbell rang, and he went to open it for the two men from the FBI. Part 2. What difference did it make what particular pen he represented? Rather, since the sober-faced men knew very well which pen it was, why should it be so necessary to them for him to confirm what they already knew without a shadow of a doubt? Now then, Mr. Disborough, one of the FBI men said, leaning his hands on the edge of the table at which the insurgent was sitting, We know who sent you. Good. Why bother me then? We know where you got your passport. We know who met you at the dock. We know your contacts. We have photographs of everyone you've met and talked to. We have tapes of every telephone call you've made or received. We also know that you are the top man in your organization here. And? They were chrysalids, every one of them. Perhaps there was no watcher behind them, perhaps. But he'd been picked up a little too quickly. The net had folded itself around him too soon. No, there had to be a watcher. He wished they'd stop this talking and bring him out. Now, I'd simply like to point out to you that this is an airtight case. No lawyer in the world will be able to break it down. You'll retain counsel, of course, but I'd simply like to point out to you that there'll be no point to any denial you may make to us. We know what you've been doing. I'd suggest you save your defense for the trial. He looked up at him and smiled ruefully. If you've got a list of charges, he said, I'll be glad to confess to all of them, provided, of course, that it is a complete list. I'm sure it doesn't list me as a werewolf, he thought. I wonder what the sentence would be. Death by firing squad equipped with silver bullets? But then he wasn't going to confess to that anyway. The FBI man looked suspicious. Obviously, he'd expected nothing of the kind. No strings, the insurgent reassured him. The job's over and it's time to punch the clock. Which was just about the way it was. But he wanted that watcher. If he was in the office at all, he'd almost have to come out to witness the confession. After all, the insurgent was supposed to be a pretty big fish. The FBI man went into a cubicle office set off to one side. When he came out carrying a sheaf of paper, the watcher was with him. The insurgent felt the hackles standing up on the back of his neck and something rumbled inaudibly at the base of his throat. He knew. He could tell. He could smell Watcher every step of the way from the day he had docked until now, when the scent, half there, half the pure intuition of instinct, rose up before him in an overpowering wave. Then he saw the look of distaste crawl across the Watcher's face, and he barked a laugh that drew curious looks from the men in the office. Hello, brother. He saw the bulge of the hip holster on the Watcher's belt and laughed again. So we play the game, he thought. We add up scores, and in the end the side with the most points wins. Forget that there should be no sides, that every point, no matter for whom scored, is a mark of shame and disgrace. He wondered briefly whether the Watcher was of his kind by choice, or whether it was simply something that had happened, as it was with him. Probably. Two separate heritages had met, represented by identical individuals who happened to have awakened in dissimilar chrysalids. Will we remember, he wondered, when we awaken, will we remember this? How we battled, blinded in the shadows of our own casting? Or was there more mercy in creation than they themselves had shown to the chrysalids? He had 3 brothers among the sleepers. When they woke, would they embrace, not remembering that each had killed the other countless times? Or forgetting that they had stood together on some battlefield? Would all the old comrades, all the bitter enemies be wiped from memory? He hoped so. With every segment of his being he hoped so, for there was no peace through eternity if it was otherwise. He stood up, lightly, tensing the muscles in his calves. The FBI men, suddenly alert, began to move for him, but he'd maneuvered things so that none of them were close enough to him. The Watcher went pale. "Shall I coalesce, brother?" the insurgent asked, the words rumbling out of his throat, a grin of derision baring his teeth. "No!" The Watcher was completely frightened. Words could be explained away, particularly if they sounded like nonsense to the other men in the room. But a werewolf, fanging the throat of a Watcher who would have to fight back with his spectacular weapons? Nothing in the world could keep the rumours from spreading. The chrysalids might even learn, finally and irrevocably, the origin of their species. "Your obligation, brother," the insurgent half laughed and kept stalking toward the Watcher. Perhaps he is my brother. And if he is, no difference. The shadows are thick and very dark. One of the other men shot him in the side, but he sprang for the Watcher, carefully human, to hold the Watcher to his debt, and the watcher shot him 3 times in the chest, once in the throat, and once in the stomach. The shape of a cross? Did he believe it himself? Was it true? A plus sign cancelling a negative force? Who knew? Shadow, shadow, all is darkness. He fell to his knees, coughing in victory. Score 1 more for the insurgents, and a watcher at that. Thank you, brother, the insurgent murmured, and fell into the long sleep with a grateful sigh. Remember to hit the like button if you're enjoying the video. Thanks. No Strings Attached by Lester Del Rey. Narrated by William Skye. Poor Henry was an unhappy husband whose wife had a habit of using bad clichés. Althea was a genie who was quite like most humans, a creature of habit. Their murder compact was absolutely perfect with... Committing a perfect murder is a simple matter. Drive out some night to a lonely road, find a single person walking along out of sight of anyone else, offer him a ride, knife him, and go home. In such a crime, there's no reason to connect killer and victim, no motive, no clue, no suspect. To achieve the perfect murder of a man's own wife, however, is a different matter. For obvious reasons, husbands are always high on the suspect list. Who has a better reason for such a crime? Henry Ainsworth had been pondering the problem with more than academic interest for some time. It wasn't that he hated his wife. He simply couldn't stand the sight or sound of her. Even thinking about her made his flesh crawl. If she had been willing to give him a divorce, he'd have been content to wish her all the happiness she was capable of discovering. But Emma, unfortunately, was fond of being his wife. Perhaps she was even fond of him. Worse, she was too rigidly bound to trite morality to give him grounds to sue. There was no hope of her straying. What had been good enough for her mother was good enough for her, and saved all need of thinking. A woman needed a husband, her place was in the home, marriage was forever, and what would the neighbours think? Anyhow, she'd have had difficulty being unfaithful even if she tried. She'd been gaining some £10 every year for the 11 years they had been married, and she'd long since stopped worrying about taking care of her appearance. He looked up at her now, letting the book drop to his lap. She sat watching the television screen with a vacant look on her face while some comic went through a tired routine. If she enjoyed it, there was no sign, though she spent half her life in front of the screen. Then the comic went off and dancers came on. She went back to darning a pair of his socks as seriously as if she didn't know that he had always refused to wear the lumpy results. Her stockings had runs, and she still wore the faded apron in which she'd cooked supper. He contrasted her with Shirley unconsciously and shuddered. In the year since Shirley Bates had come to work in his rare bookstore, he'd done a lot of such shuddering, and never because of the slim, blonde warmth of his assistant. Since that hot day in August when they'd closed the shop early and he'd suggested a ride in the country to cool off, he and Shirley... He was interrupted in his more pleasant thoughts by the crash of scissors onto the floor, and his eyes focused on the deepening folds of fat as Emma bent to retrieve them. "Company coming," she said, before he could think of anything to prevent the mistaken cliché. Then she became aware that he was staring at her. "Did you take the garbage out, Henry?" "Yes, dear," he answered woodenly. Then, because he knew it was coming anyhow, he filled in the inevitable. "Cleanliness is next to godliness." She nodded solemnly and began putting aside her darning. "That's finished. Mama always said a stitch in time saves 9. If you'd cut your toenails, Henry..." He could feel his skin begin to tingle with irritation. But there was no escape. If he went upstairs to his bedroom, she'd be up at once, puttering about. If he went to the basement, she'd find the canned food needed checking. A woman's place was with her husband, as she repeatedly told him. Probably she couldn't stand her own company either. Then he remembered something he'd stored away. "There's a new picture at the Metro," he said as quietly as he could. "Taylor's starred, I think. I was going to take you before this extra work came up." He could see her take the bait and nibble at it. She had some vague crush left for Taylor. She stared at the television set, shifted her bulk, and then shook her head reluctantly. "It'd be nice, Henry, but going at night costs so much, and, well, a penny saved is a penny earned." "Exactly. That's what I meant to say." He even relaxed enough to overlook the platitude now that there was some hope. "I saved the price of lunch today. The nut who wanted King in Yellow was so tickled to get the copy finally he insisted on treating. You can even take a cab home afterwards." "That's nice. It'll probably rain the way my bunion's been aching." She considered it a second more before cutting off the television. He watched as she drew off the apron and went for her coat and hat, making a pretense of dabbing on makeup. She might as well have worn the apron, he decided, as she came over to kiss him a damp goodbye. He considered calling Shirley, but her mother was visiting her and the conversation would have to be too guarded at her end. If he could find some way of getting rid of Emma. It wouldn't even be murder, really. More like destroying a vegetable. Certainly no worse than ending the life of a dumb cow to make man's life more worth living. It wasn't as if she had anything to live for or to contribute. It would almost be a kindness, since she lived in a perpetual state of vague discontent and unhappiness, as if somehow aware that she had lost herself. But unfortunately the law wouldn't look at it in such a light. He'd only been thinking actively of getting her out of the way since August, however, and somehow with time there must be some foolproof scheme. There was that alcohol injection system, but it required someone who would drink pretty freely first, and Emma was a teetotaler. Maybe, though, if he could get her to taking some of those tonics for women. He dropped it for the moment and turned back to the book. It was an odd old volume he'd received with a shipment for appraisal. There was no title or date, but the strange leather binding showed it was old. Apparently it had been hand-set and printed on some tiny press by the writer whose name was omitted. It seemed to be a mixture of instructions on how to work spells, conjure demons, and practice witchcraft, along with bitter tirades against the group who had driven the writer out and forced him, as he put it, to enter a compact with the devil for to be a wizard, which is like to a male witch. Henry had been reading it idly, slowly deciding the book was authentic enough, however crazy the writer was. The book had no particular value as a collector's item, but he could probably get a fine price from some of the local cultists, particularly since there were constant promises in it that the writer was going to give a surefire, positive, and simple recipe for conjuring up a demon without need of virgin blood, graveyard earth, or unicorn horn. He skimmed through it, looking for the formula. It turned up on the 5th page from the end and was everything the writer had claimed. A 5-sided figure drawn on the floor with ordinary candle wax, a pinch of sugar inside, a bit of something bitter outside, 2 odd but simple finger gestures, and a string of words in bad Latin and worse Greek. There was a warning that it would work without the pentagram, sugar, and bitters, but at parlous risk to the conjurer without such protection. He frowned. Too simple for the cultists, he realized, unless he could somehow persuade them that the trick lay in some exact phrasing or gesturing pattern which took experiment. They liked things made difficult, so they'd have a good alibi for their faith when the tricks failed. If he could show them in advance that it didn't work, but hint that a good occultist might figure out the right rhythm or whatever. He read it through again, trying to memorize the whole thing. The gestures were so, and the words, There was no flash of fire, no smell of sulphur, and no clap of thunder. There was simply a tall creature with yellowish skin and flashing yellow eyes standing in front of the television set. His head was completely hairless, and he was so tall that he had to duck slightly to keep from crashing into the ceiling. His eyes were too sharp for any human face. There were no scales, however. His gold cape and black tights were spangled, and he wore green shoes with turned-up toes. But generally he wasn't bad-looking. "Mind if I sit down?" the creature asked. He took Henry's assent for granted and dropped into Emma's chair, folding his cape over one arm and reaching for an apple on the side table. "Glad to see you're not superstitious enough to keep me locked up in one of those damned pentagrams. Drat it, I thought the last copy of that book was burned and I was free. Your signal caught me in the middle of dinner." Henry swallowed thickly, feeling the sweat trickle down his nose. The book had warned against summoning the demon without the protective devices, but the thing seemed peaceful enough for the moment. He cleared his voice. You mean magic works?" "Magic schmagic," the creature snorted. He jerked his thumb toward the television. "To old Ephraim, the crackpot who wrote the book before he went completely crazy, that set would have been more magic than I am. I thought this age knew about dimensions, planes of vibrations, and simultaneous universes. You humans always were a backward race, but you seem to be learning the basic facts. Hell, I suppose that means you'll lay a gay ass on me, after I was hoping it was just an experimental summons." Henry puzzled it over, with some of the fright leaving him. The scientific-sounding terms somehow took some of the magic off the appearance of the thing. "You mean those passes and words set up some sort of vibrational pattern?" The hairless fellow snorted again and began attacking the grapes. "Bunk, Henry. Oh, my name's Alvear, by the way. I was a fool. I should have gone back to my psychiatrist and taken the 50-year course, as he advised. But I thought the books were all burned and nobody knew the summons. So here I am, stuck with the habit. Because that's all it is, a conditioned reflex. Pure compulsory behavior. I'm sensitized to receive the summons, and when it comes, I teleport into your plane just the way you pull your hand off a hot stove. You read the whole book, I suppose? Yeah, just my luck. Then you know I'm stuck with any job you give me, practically your slave. I can't even get back without dismissal or finishing your task. That's what comes of saving money by not going to my psychiatrist." He muttered unhappily, reaching for more grapes, while Henry began to decide nothing was going to happen to him, at least physically. Souls were things he wasn't quite sure of, but he couldn't see how just talking to Alfear could endanger his. "Still," the creature said thoughtfully, "it could be worse. No pentagram. I never did get mixed up with some of the foul odours and messes some of my friends had to take. And I've developed quite a taste for sugar, tobacco too." He reached out and plucked a cigarette out of Henry's pack and then a book of matches. He lighted it, inhaled, and rubbed the flame out on his other palm. "Kind of weak tobacco, but not bad. Any more questions while I smoke this? There's no free oxygen where I come from, so I can't smoke there." "But if you demons answer such summons, why don't people know about it now?" Henry asked. "I think more and more people would be going in for this sort of thing. If the wizards were right all along." "They weren't, and we're not demons. It didn't get started until your Middle Ages. And if it hadn't been for old Apollon—" Alfea lighted another cigarette off the butt, which he proceeded to extinguish on the tip of his sharp tongue. He scratched his head thoughtfully and went on. "Apollon was studying your worship. You see, we've been studying your race the way you study white rats, using lower races to explain our own behavior. Anyhow, he got curious and figured out a way to mentalize himself into your plane. He was sort of a practical joker, you might say. So he picked a time when some half-crazy witch was trying to call up the being you worship as Satan to make some kind of a deal. Just as she finished, he popped up in front of her, spitting out a bunch of phosphorus to make a nice smoke and fire effect, and agreed with all her mumbo-jumbo about having to do what she wanted. She wanted her heart fixed up then, so he showed her how to use belladonna and went back, figuring it was a fine joke. Only he made a mistake. There's something about moving between planes that lowers the resistance to conditioning. Some of our people can take 5 or 6 trips, but Apollon was one of those who was so conditioning prone that he had the habit fixed after the first trip. The next time she did the rigmarole, back he popped. He had to dig up gold for her, hypnotize a local baron into marrying her, and generally keep on the constant qui-vive until she got sloppy and forgot the pentagram she thought protected her and which he was conditioned to. But after he disintegrated her, he found she'd passed on the word to a couple of other witches. And he knew somebody at the Institute was bound to find what a fool he'd made of himself. So he began taking members aside and telling them about the trick of getting into your world. Excellent chance for study. Have to humor the humans by sticking to their superstitions, of course. One by one they went over on little trips. It wasn't hard to find some superstitious dolt trying to summon something, since word had got around in your world. One of us would pop up, and that spread the word further. Anyhow, when Apollon was sure each member had made enough trips to be conditioned, he'd tell him the sad truth and swear him to secrecy on penalty of being laughed out of the Institute. The old blackguard wound up with all of us conditioned. There was quite a flurry of witchcraft here until we finally found a psychiatrist who could break the habit for us. Even then it was tough going. We'd never have made it without the inquisitions and witch burnings one of our experimental sociologists managed to stir up. Althea put out the 3rd cigarette butt and stood up slowly. Look, I don't mind a chat now and then, but my wife's awaiting dinner. How about dismissing me? Henry had been thinking while he listened. It had sounded like a reasonable explanation on the whole, except for the bit about Apollon's disintegrating the witch. Apparently, as long as a man wasn't too unreasonable, there was a certain usefulness to having such friends on call. What about the price for your help? I mean, well, about souls. Althea twitched his ears disgustedly. What the deuce would I do with your soul, Henry? Eat it? Wear it? Don't be a schnook. Well, I've heard about wishes that were granted, but they all had a trick attached. If I asked for immortality, you'd give it, say, but then I'd get some horrible disease and beg and plead for death. Or ask for money and then find the money was recorded as being paid to a kidnapper or something. In the first place, I couldn't give you immortality, Althea said as patiently as he apparently could. Your metabolism's not like ours. In the second place, why should I look for tainted money? It's enough nuisance doing what you ask without looking for tricks to pull. Anyhow, I told you I half enjoy visiting here. As long as you're reasonable about it, I don't mind keeping my end of the compulsion going. If you've got something to ask, ask away. There are no strings attached. The creature seemed to be quite sincere. Henry considered it briefly, staring at a large tinted picture of Emma, and took the plunge. Suppose I asked you to kill my wife for me, say by what looked like a stroke, so nobody would blame me. That seems reasonable enough, Althea agreed easily. I could break a few blood vessels inside her skull. Sure, why not? Only the picture in your mind is so distorted I wouldn't know her. If she's like that, why do you ever marry her? Because she seemed different from other women, I guess, Henry admitted. When I tipped the canoe over and I figured she'd be mad because her dress was ruined, all she said was something about not being sugar so she wouldn't melt. He shuddered, remembering all the times she'd said it since. You won't have any trouble. Look, can you really read my mind? Naturally, but it's all disorganized. Well. It gave him a queasy feeling to think of anyone seeing his secret thoughts. But this fellow apparently didn't work by human attitudes anyhow. He groped about and then smiled grimly. All right then, you can tell I think of her as my wife, and just to make sure, she'll be sure to say something about early to bed and early to rise. She says that every single damned night, Althea. She never misses. Althea grunted. Sounds more reasonable every minute, Henry. All right, when your wife says that, I pop out and give her a stroke that will kill her. How about dismissing me now? No strings? Henry asked. He watched carefully as Althea nodded assent, and he could see no sign of cunning or trickery. He caught his breath, nodded, and closed his eyes. Seeing something vanish was nothing he wanted. Dismissed. The fruit was still gone when he opened his eyes, but there was no other sign of the thing. He found some fruit still in the refrigerator and restocked the bowl. Then he closed the strange book and put it away. He'd have to buy it himself and burn it to make sure no one else found the trick, of course. For a moment, uneasiness pricked at him. Yet he was sure Althea hadn't been lying, and the story the creature had told made more sense than the older superstitions. Henry adjusted his mind to having a well-conditioned demon on tap, and then began the harder job of bracing himself for Emma's incoherent but detailed account of the movie when she came back. Unfortunately, it was a more complicated plot than usual, and she went on and on from the moment she entered the door. He tried to close his ears, but he'd never succeeded in that. He yawned, and she yawned back, but went on until the last final morsel was covered for the second or third time. He was wonderful, she finally concluded. Just wonderful. Only I wished you'd come with me. You'd have liked it. Henry, did you take the garbage out? Yes, dear, he answered. Hours ago. He yawned elaborately again. She mumbled something about having to keep the kitchen clean because cleanliness was next to godliness, but her automatic yawn muffled the words. Then she glanced at the clock. Heavens, it's almost 1. And early to bed and early to rise. Henry jerked his eyes away just as he caught the first glimpse of Althea popping into existence beside her. He heard the beginning of a shriek change to a horrible gargling and then become a dying moan. Something soft and heavy hit the floor with a dull thud. Henry turned around slowly. Dead, Althea said calmly, rubbing one of his fingers. This business of getting just one finger through the planes into her head cuts off the circulation. There, that's better. Satisfied? Henry dropped beside the corpse. She was dead according to the mirror test, and there wasn't a mark on her. He stared at the puffy, relaxed features. He'd expected an expression of horror, but she seemed simply asleep. His initial feeling of pity and contrition vanished. After all, it had been quick and nearly painless. Now he was free. Thanks, Althea, he said. It's fine. Do I dismiss you now? No need this time. I'm free as soon as the job's done, unless you'd like to talk a while. Henry shook his head quickly. He had to telephone a doctor. Then he could call Shirley. Her mother would be gone by now. Not now. Maybe I'll summon you sometime for a smoke or something, but not now. Okay, Althea said and vanished. Surprisingly, seeing him disappear wasn't unpleasant after all. He just wasn't there. Waiting for the doctor was the worst part of it. All the legends Henry knew ran through his mind. Althea could have given her a stroke and then added some violent poison that would show up in an autopsy. He could be sitting wherever he was, chuckling because Henry hadn't restricted his wish enough to be safe. Or any of 100 things could happen. There was the first witch who had thought she had Apollon under control, only to be turned to dust. But the doctor took it calmly enough. Stroke, all right, he decided. I warned her last year that she was putting on too much weight and getting high blood pressure. Too bad, Mr. Ainsworth, but there was nothing you could do. I'll turn in a certificate. Want me to contact a mortician for you?" Henry nodded, trying to appear properly grief-stricken. I'd appreciate it." "Too late now," the doctor said, "but I'll be glad to send Mr. Glazier around in the morning." He pulled the sheet up over Emma's body, leaving it on the backroom couch to which they had carried it. "You'd better go to a hotel for the night, and I'll give you something that will make you sleep." "I'd rather not," Henry said quickly. "I mean, I'd feel better here, you know." "Certainly, certainly." The doctor nodded sympathetically, but as if it were an old story to him. He left the pills with instructions, said the proper things again, and finally went out. Shirley's voice was sleepy and cross when she answered, but it grew alert as soon as he told her about Emma's stroke. He was almost beginning to believe the simple version of the story himself. "Poor Henry," she murmured. Her voice sharpened again. "It was a stroke? The doctor was sure?" "Positive," he assured her, cursing himself for having let her guess some of the thoughts that had been on his mind. "The doctor said she'd had hypertension and such before." She considered it a second, and then a faint laugh sounded. "Then I guess there's no use in crying over spilled milk, is there, Henry? If it had to happen, it just had to. And I mean, it's like fate, almost." "It is fate," he agreed happily. Then he dropped his voice. "And now I'm all alone here, baby lamb, and I had to call you up." She caught on at once, as she always did. "You can't stay there now. It's so morbid. Henry, you come right over here." Demons, Henry thought as he drove the car through the quiet residential streets toward her apartment, had their uses. They were a much maligned breed. Probably the people who had summoned them before had been ignorant, stupid people. They'd messed up their chances and brought trouble on themselves by not finding out the facts and putting it all down to superstitious magic. The fellows were almost people, maybe even a little superior to humans. If a man would just try to understand them, they could help him, and with no danger at all. "No strings attached," he said to himself, and then chuckled softly. It fitted perfectly. Now there were no strings attached to him. Emma was at peace, and he was free. He'd have to wait a few months to marry Shirley legally, of course, but already she was as good as his wife. And if he played up the shock angle just enough, this could be a wonderful evening again. Shirley was unusually lovely when she met him at the door. Her soft golden hair made a halo for her face, a face that said she'd already anticipated his ideas and had decided he was a man who needed sympathy and understanding for what had happened. There was even time for the idea that he was free to be brought up, tentatively at first, and then eventually as a matter of course. And the plans expanded as he considered them. There was no need to worry about things now. The quiet marriage became a trip around the world as he confessed to having money that no one knew about. They could close the shop. He could leave town almost at once and she could follow later. Nobody would know, and they wouldn't have to wait to avoid any scandal. They could be married in 2 weeks. Henry was just realizing the values of a friendly demon. With proper handling, a lot of purely friendly summoning, and a reasonable attitude, there was no reason why Alfear couldn't provide him with every worldly comfort to share with Shirley. He caught her to him again. "My own little wife. That's what you are, lambkins. What's a mere piece of paper? I already think of you as my wife. I feel you're my wife. That's what counts, isn't it?" "That's all that counts," she agreed with a warmth that set fire to his blood. Then she gasped, "Henry, darling, it's getting light already. You'll have to get back. What will the neighbours say if they see you coming from here now?" He tore away reluctantly, swearing at the neighbours. But she was right, of course. He had to go back and take the sleeping medicine to be ready for the arrival of the mortician in the morning. "It's still early," he protested, automatically trying to squeeze out a few more minutes. "Nobody's up yet." "I'll heat up the coffee and then you'll have to go," Shirley said firmly, heading for the kitchen. "Plenty of people get up early around here. And besides, you need some sleep. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and—" From the kitchen came the beginning of a shriek. It changed to a horrible gasp and died away in a failing moan. There was the sound of a body hitting the floor. Alfear stood over Shirley's body, rubbing one finger tenderly. His ears twitched uncertainly as he studied Henry's horror-frozen face. "I told you," he said. "I warned you some of us get conditioned to a habit the first time. And you thought of her as your wife, and she said—" Abruptly, he vanished. Henry's screams were the only sound in the apartment. Thanks for listening. For more stories like these, head over to the playlist section of the Stories from the Sky SFF channel. There are dozens of compilations with different themes, as well as hundreds of standalone stories. There are even more over on my Substack, linked in the description, where I experiment with different genres like mythology and poetry. See you in the next one.